Hello and welcome to Catholic Unscripted. I'm Katherine Bennett.
I'm Mark Lambert.
I'm Gavin Ashenden.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to all of you who have visited our website, picked up a membership. And if you did, you'll know that there is a new blog out today by Sebastian Morello. So if you are interested in reading that, take a look at our website, pick up a membership. Today, well, we've been contacted by a viewer who said that they were forwarded a prayer apparently penned by Pope Francis when he was in hospital. And he says that he or she, we don't know, says that they found a few sources, so it seems to be legitimate. But we have not yet been able to verify whether it's legitimate or not. And that's part of the conversation we'll have. But we'll share the prayer for you here to take a look. And it's interesting as we look at this prayer, our viewer comments that it has some very positive and true sentiments, but it doesn't sit right for a number of reasons. First of all, there's a lack of mention of God or Jesus, especially considering it's from a pope, if indeed it is. And there's a mention of the creator at the end, which feels very similar to the Freemasonry construct of the great architect. A few other things didn't sit right with this viewer. The line, more honest prayers than churches, feels like a passive-aggressive dig at the church, and from a pope no less. The modernist fixation on the preeminent sins of racism and homophobia are almost central to this whole thesis. And then there's the line, walk your own path, which is very counter to the teaching of the church. Well, listen, we don't know whether this was written by Pope Francis or not. But what's interesting is that people are very keen to believe that it has been, aren't they, Gavin?
Yes, when we first began discussing this a few hours ago...
Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, very clearly. Very
Okay.
good quality.
Okay.
Let's run with that then.
Yeah, just don't move or breathe. Okay.
Okay.
Gavin, as you were.
Look surprised, Gavin.
Quite.
Sorry.
God, it's like that photographer.
That's what I keep...
With the Pope coming up behind me is in order to provide a picture of surprise on my... and alarm on my face. So I can give you surprise and alarm if you wanted. I'm surprised and alarmed that this might be attributed to Pope Francis, because when we began talking about this a few hours ago, we did some searches on the internet and it had no purchase at all. And it looked like it was a clever parody. And one of the things that's happened in the intervening time is that some people have taken it up and they said, oh, look, our Pope is praying a rather moving prayer. So it's a very moving prayer if you're a progressive, because as Katherine described earlier on, it shows, it prioritizes the contemporary sins of hate crime and malthought over sins of the soul. It's a social prayer rather than a spiritual prayer. The problem is that it looked when we began the conversation as though Pope Francis hadn't written it, because if he had, there would be some documentation on the Vatican website, and they're completely silent about it. However, it's going to become something that Pope Francis might have written or did write, because people are going to adopt it in his name and say, oh, look, this is the kind of thing we'd like a progressive Pope to write. Clearly, if he didn't write it, he should have done. And so we move from he didn't to he should have to he has, and all in a few steps because of public acclamation. I think almost certainly Pope Francis didn't write this prayer, but some people are going to think he did and present it as, in which case he might almost have done. So it's a problem for us all.
It's a very interesting observation on the importance of an origin story. I was talking with Anthony at Avoiding Babylon, our friends over at Avoiding Babylon, about Severance, if anybody's watched that Apple TV series. And it's quite gruesomely dark, in my view. I know it's probably meant to be darkly comic. It's a very grim series. And it all centres around this origin story of this fictitious person called Kia, and they go to great lengths to create the story and the backstory. And in Till We Have Faces, C.S. Lewis has this princess from Glome, Orowal. When she becomes queen, she goes out of the kingdom and sees the story, her own story of her relationship with her sister, set up as this new story of this goddess. And it's very interesting to watch people trying to create origin stories around something that they want to promote, something that they believe in, to replace often the true origin story. And we see it, of course, with the story of Genesis being messed around with. But this seems to me to be either true, in which case it's unsurprising, interestingly, or set up as representative of all that Pope Francis stands for, like a kind of totem pole almost to Francis, doesn't it, Mark?
That's what surprised me about it. Like, as you're reading through it, it really could easily be Pope Francis. So I was expecting it to be Pope Francis, but it's not on Vatican News or any of the places. So it originated with this this Redemptorist website in Liverpool, didn't it? So some of the Redemptorists are brilliant, and some of them can be a little bit wacky. Some of the older ones. So I did think, I don't know the priest there, Tim Buckley. I don't know whether he's a goodie or a baddie, but if he's posting this, like you say, it sort of would lead you to think that he likes it or wherever he's heard it from. But it does seem to be all the things that people say Pope Francis, sort of signals in favour of. And it's quite jarring, really, in with the critical points that our viewer sent in, that they are deeply at odds, really, with Catholic identity and thought. It quite starkly puts into relief just how at odds those issues are. And the fact that it's been promoted really is, gives you a really good idea of the people who are on side with Catholic thinking and who are trying to promote something else. And it always strikes me that those people are like, they hate it. They seem to hate Catholic teaching, and they want to promote some sort of viral, damaging antithesis from within the church. It always amazes me that it comes from within the church, trying to turn it into the opposite of what it actually is. But then I suppose if it was true and good and beautiful and the devil wanted to attack it, there's no real better way for him to do it than from the inside out, is there?
Yeah, absolutely. And it really shows, I think, the power of the media as well, and the age that we're living in, doesn't it, Gavin? That if people want this to be true, then it can really spread very quickly and sort of almost become true. It's not unlike Vatican II, as Mark spends some of his time very clearly going through Vatican II and showing demonstrating the hermeneutic of continuity, and yet we have this spirit of Vatican II, almost like this perversion of what was intended, but it's got traction because it's kind of just been popular and it's taken hold. And so people are left not knowing if they're practicing things liturgically because that's what the church insists upon, or just because it's been presented and they've gone running with it. Do you see what I mean? So it shows how something like this prayer could be picked up. People love it. They jump on it. They start quoting it. It starts to be attributed to Pope Francis. And before you know it, it's got all around the world, and he never even wrote it in the first place.
I think the issue of truth has become really very problematic. For example, the way in which the media target certain people. Let me not mention any names to avoid exciting people, but you can think of people who are no longer accepted as reasonable members of society because of what commentators have put into their mouths as their views. Very often, if they ever get a chance to defend themselves, they say, I didn't say this, I don't think this, I don't believe this. Certain, well-known fascists or racists. And in fact, one of the problems is that you only need to be accused of a thought crime and for people to think you might have created a thought crime to make it almost completely irrelevant whether or not you hold those views, because they become attached to you and you can't disassociate yourself, or people think it's special pleading. So particularly with social media and the power of the internet, the power of putting a view into several million people's minds at once. I think perhaps probably the simplest example and the least contentious one, because I think of many more ones, is Trump. So that the way in which Trump is portrayed by one part of the media seems to me, as I hear him speak and look at his actions, to be very different. So I've laughed about Trump derangement syndrome, and I think it's quite funny the way in which he uses it to discombobulate people. But the really serious thing is that people are terrified that he's a fascist, a fascist dictator who is going to take away civil rights, close down democracy, close down freedom of expression. And it's almost, well, it is certainly not true. But it doesn't just apply to Trump, it applies to other public figures who've been deplatformed, depersonalized. And therefore, to go back to what you were saying earlier on, being able to know what the truth is has suddenly become a really difficult procedure, and one in which we have to do more than just Google sometimes to find the origin of something, but pay real attention so people aren't demonized with the control of media presenting them as something else other than they are.
Well, Mark, Gavin said there that there are real fears around Trump, who is going to close down democracy. And that brings us nicely to an article that Sebastian Morello has just written for us here on Catholic Unscripted. So do please take a look. It's an absolutely fantastic, it's more of an essay. It's a kind of 2,000 word commentary on democracy and what it is, why we hang on to it so dearly, and whether or not it has to be coupled with liberalism as we understand it to be. But I thought this was brilliant. And in fact, one of the arguments he makes in it is that Trump is, in a sense, more of a monarchical figure, an emperor, than a president as understood in the continental sense. And that with his executive orders, he has more power than any medieval monarch would have had. So he titles this the new epoch of empires. Democracy may be over, but should Catholics care? I think this is a really interesting talking point. Should we care if democracy is over? Do we cling to it without really thinking about why, as Catholics especially, Mark?
Well, this is really interesting. It's one of I'm sure Gavin's got some really interesting thoughts on it as well. Yeah, because I've long thought, it's long come to me that it's something you can't do is criticise democracy in our society. It's absolutely verboten to have any problem with it. And yet we've seen the rise of the demagogue over the last few years. And the liberals, like the illiberal, undemocratic party, particularly, are up in arms. They're up in arms about these demagogues. They're absolutely, the thin end of the wedge, and we can't have this. But that is surely, if you study what democracy is, that is democracy, isn't it? Is that they're, and this is, if you understand ancient Greece, this is exactly what Plato and Aristotle warned. We look to ancient Greece as the cradle of democracy, but they had a very particular kind of democracy, didn't they? They were very careful about who was involved, whose opinions were allowed to be listened to, and that there was a very specific demographic that was allowed to take part in decision making. But it wasn't just anyone by any stretch of the imagination. It was a very limited experiment, and it failed dramatically when there was this big war with Sicily, wasn't there? So it was in the end thrown out. And certainly Aristotle was against it. He marked it down as one of the bad forms of governance. And that's because of this thing that we're sort of seeing now, which is that you can have demagogues who are able to sway the uneducated and push them in one direction or the other. And I just find that hilarious that the people who are cross about it are the liberals. It's like they've got no understanding of history or society at all. It always struck me as a weird way to carry on because, as Catholics, we've got this tension with things like the death penalty, for example, where if you had a popular vote, you'd have the death penalty in straight away. And so, like, you know, I think Pope Benedict XVI beautifully put it when he said, you know, truth isn't decided by, you know, the majority opinion. You know, that doesn't, and that's what I've always thought. Well, I don't want to be ruled by the majority. I want to be ruled by the brightest, by the cleverest, by the people who are qualified to look after us. And that's really what Morello beautifully exposes in this essay, talking about, like, why is that such an important thing? And when you look at the history of democracy, obviously, it's forged in the West over hundreds of years, born of the Enlightenment, and it's wedded it to liberalism, hasn't it? In a way that's made it, you know, and America is the crucible of all of that, more than anywhere else, really. It's like in America that it's become this thing that you can't criticize and you can't, you know, it's. But who was it? Was it Churchill who said it's the best form of government? It's the worst form of government apart from all the others. You know, so we have to understand that it's an imperfect system. And so Morello's saying, as Catholics, do we care if it's democracy or if it's something else? What difference does it make?
Yeah, although I think when you say something else, I think that leads on to a further discussion, which we might have then down the line, about the loss of sovereignty of Christ, the loss of Christ as King, and the abandoning of authority in the church over to the so-called state. But I'll just pick out a couple of lines here. Brilliant. But by the way, Morello goes into all of that, goes back to the early Greeks, and teases out some of those things that you've just said there, Mark, and it's very, very well worth a read. I think it's come at a really important time. I'm actually really excited about this article because I think it's addressing in a succinct way some of the things that we really probably are aware of, have an intuition about, but can't put into words. And Sebastian Morello,
Yeah, that's exactly. I think this all the time. It's like we've got a sense that it's the right thing, but we're not able to explain it properly, and that's why this is particularly useful, I think.
Yeah, and that's why actually it's good to get good writers who are able to put into words the things that there's a frustration there, isn't there? I'm sensing something, but I can't articulate it. So thank you to Sebastian for that. Just a couple of lines here. He points to that irony that, for example, in Romania earlier this year, and as they threatened to do in Germany, power holders can veto a democratic election with no sense of irony whatsoever, just as they tried to denounce Donald Trump or Viktor Orban. And he says, as it happens, countries where there is a liberal stranglehold, with the various parties performatively disagreeing on all sorts of policy questions, but in reality forming a uniparty under a single liberal ideology, democracy finds itself in crisis. Such is the case in the UK, right here, where the dominant parties all seem to be animated by one ideology, liberalism. And so he asks us to question why we hold liberalism, why we couple liberalism and democracy so closely and are not prepared to uncouple those. And perhaps that's something to think about. And then ends the piece by having us reflect as Catholics on what it really means to say Christ is King, and what we've lost when we lose Christ as King. But I think this is a very important article and has come at a crucial time. Would you say, Gavin?
Yes, we're certainly at the breakdown of social order, and no one knows what's going to replace it. I'm reminded of the joke that Gandhi played on people when he arrived in England, and the reporter said, "So what do you think of Western civilization, Mr. Gandhi?" And he said, I think it would be a very good idea. Because, you know, what do you think of democracy? Well, it would be nice if we had it. We don't have it. We don't have it at all. And so I think the first thing to say is that we are presented with the shibboleth or the appearance of democracy as if we had it. We're back again to the issue of truth again. It isn't true that we have democracy at the moment. We're given the appearance of it, and the opportunities of people to express their political will through the ballot box are extremely limited and enormously ineffective. And anyway, what kind of democracy is it if you're choosing between A and B, where A and B appear to think and believe almost exactly the same things, but are just given different names. So, but what Morello is doing, I think, is saying to Catholics, you may think that there is an instinctive and automatic link between the Catholic mindset and the democratic vote, but there isn't. So if it was taken away, how bad would that be? And then, of course, we're into this cycle of, well, what would it be like if we had a benign emperor or a benign autocracy? And then what if it's not benign? What if it's malign? I think the only answer is you can say that to the Catholic, the real response is Jesus. Whose face do you find upon this coin? Well, pay to the people who rule you what they require you to pay as part of the social contract or order, whatever it is. But the real thing is to make sure that you give to God what is his.
I think you're right that it's important to raise that question as to whether Catholics need worry about not being fully supportive of democracy. But what I think is particularly interesting about what Morello is raising here, because we know we're Catholics, we're a weird bunch, right? Aren't we? We're on the fringes and the outskirts. What he's doing is something very powerful, which is saying perhaps we fail to recognise that democracy and liberalism are not synonymous, or not as synonymous as you think they are. And he says here, people fail to recognise that when populist movements obtain a presence in the long-established political organs of a country, or a populist figure rises to a position of power on account of gaining support from voters, that is because, in such cases, democracy is actually working very well indeed. And I think that may be, more generally, a very, very important point to make, to have liberals question whether to say, what does democracy look like? And if democracy looks like populism, then you have to start saying, do I still support democracy? What is it that I want? Do I want liberalism or democracy? But they're not necessarily one synonymous with the other. I think that's a very good thing to kind of tease out, don't you?
Well, and to Gavin's brilliant point there about, we're at a stage in history where it doesn't really matter what party you vote for, because they're offering the same thing. So you can see that. How does that bleed out into society? It results in a lack of engagement with the democratic process. And we've seen that in failing, election turnouts for decades now, haven't we? It's just been a story of decline because the parties are offering the same thing. And it doesn't matter who you vote in, nothing changes. It's the same thing anyway. They're all just fighting for the middle ground.
Yeah, it might be worth dipping our toe in the implications of Dignitatis Humanae, from which you'll be an expert on, Mark, from the Second Vatican Council, where this is around this point is this question about how much the church gives over to the so-called state. We were having this discussion yesterday about bishops, maybe traditional or conservative bishops, who in today's world, bemoan and complain and say it's outrageous that you can't administer the last rites to somebody during COVID. It's terrible that when David Amis was murdered, the police shut the priest out and said, you can't, this is a crime scene. Sorry, you can't be here. And the churches were closed. You can't receive the sacraments. Well, the government say so. Okay, we can't give you the sacraments then. That instead of complaining about this overreach, this is exactly what Dignitatis Humanae allowed for. And perhaps that's the question is, if you're going to complain about this, why has the church allowed for this level of overreach by the state? Because why can't police say, no, you're not going near this person to give them the last rites? Why can't they say?
Well, how does Dignitatis Humanae? Well, how does Dignitatis Humanae lead us there then?
Well, by stating what the church has always stated, but then saying within due limits. So it's acknowledging that there are limits, that the church is happy to limit itself.
Cool. I think it's a bit of a thin point, isn't it? Really. I mean, does it mean that? I don't think it means that you can't give the sacraments out during COVID. What we saw in COVID was the fact that our bishops have got to a point where they don't really think that the sacraments are efficacious. That's the only conclusion you can come to with it, or that that there is no supernatural dimension to the faith.
Yeah, but they'd say because the church doesn't. That's fine. The church doesn't expect us to. It doesn't allow it for us to, and it doesn't insist upon it. So therefore, why am I going to argue with the government if they say shut your churches? Okay, I'll shut my churches.
Well, I can't see how that's.
Would a church in the medieval world have said, okay, we'll shut our churches because the government say we have to?
Well, that's quite the point I'm making. Really, is that the medieval church, even during the plague, didn't do that. The priests went out and the bishops went out and ministered to the sick, and that was the thing that I found most disturbing about the whole COVID crisis. Really, it was the opposite. It was keep them away from us. That was what they seemed to be interested in, and it's not just me. There's hundreds of people who feel the same way. I don't think I think that's just a change that we've seen in a lot of that generation of churchmen, that, and it's evident in their rhetoric as much as it is in anything else. I don't think you can say it's a bleed through from Dignitatis Humanae. I've never heard anyone use Dignitatis Humanae to justify anything like that. I think it's just a loss of faith that we see, and we see it in America. We see it this is why they've just had a Eucharistic conference, isn't it? Because there is a decline in the way that people believe in the metaphysical realities of our faith, and that's part. I think a lot of that is to do with the rise of Protestantism as well, because Protestantism, born out of the Enlightenment, it doesn't like magic. It doesn't like saints who flew. It doesn't like Eucharistic miracles. It's very uncomfortable with, the reality of John 6. It doesn't like the bread of life discourse at all, because it doesn't believe in the real presence. I'm sorry, Gavin doesn't like us using that phrase. What do I have to call it?
the miracle of the Mass. Well, the only reason I don't like us using it is that
they use it as well.
But they use it to mean something completely different. So it sounds like we're all talking about the same thing, and they're not talking about the miracle of the Mass. They're certainly not talking about the representation of the sacrifice of Christ, nor are they talking about the transformation of the elements. But let's go back to I'd like to take it on one further and to bring it back to the theme we were talking about earlier on, which is this is a contest for truth again, because one of the reasons why the bishops allowed the churches to be closed during COVID was because they swallowed the truth that the political democratic system said, which was you're going to kill your granny, that the keeping people alive and not taking risks with your neighbor in terms of affecting them were the most important thing of all, because you needed to be nice. This was a way of loving your neighbor. Well, they were wrong at every level. They were wrong for Catholics in terms of saying the most important thing is not killing your neighbor, not being nice to your neighbor. They were wrong medically. They were wrong socially. They were wrong at every level, but they presented a truth that the churches were unwilling to dispute with. And so I think we're back. I'd like to see us coming back to the centrality of taking the truth very seriously and not simply accepting what other people present to us as being true, when it requires a lot more hard work to find out what the truth really is.
Yeah, I think the reason I mention Dignitatis Humanae is because I do think there's a link there. I know you don't seem to see it, but the reason I picked up on some of the wording of Dignitatis Humanae is because the words "within due limits" in the context of Dignitatis Humanae refers to the idea that religious freedom, while a fundamental right, is not absolute and can be subject to reasonable limitations to safeguard public order and the common good, which is exactly what we're talking about. This abolishing the idea of Christ as king. Every man has a natural duty right and capacity to worship God. Every single man has a natural duty, right and capacity to worship God. And Dignitatis Humanae comes along, and you can say, well, bishops and priests have just lost their faith and they don't believe in God, but one follows from the other. You are going to get a situation where you, as the church, has no authority. It's abandoned and reneged that authority. And so when you're in a crisis where a bishop says, hang on, we want to be able to administer the sacraments, we want to be able to go and see someone on their deathbed and give them the last rites because their eternal soul matters, you have the state saying, no, this is a crime scene. No, the police are here. No, there's a pandemic, don't you know? And the church can't say, well, hang on a minute, we're the church. We are Christ's mouthpiece on earth. Christ is king. You are subject to this. Oh no, we're subject to you. And that it may be something small, but out of that, I think one follows from the other.
Well, you're taking a position. It doesn't say that in the document. You're saying that that's an interpretation of it.
Yes, but that's part of my point. We began with the problem posed by this things getting around the world. A lie. What is it? Churchill also said, a lie gets around the world before truth has a chance to put its pants on. That actually we live with liturgical abuse. We live with masses where there's guitar playing and rainbow flags hanging on the altar. It's not okay. It's not what the church teaches, but it happens. This really does happen. And the reason it happens is because there were enough ambiguities to allow for these abuses. And now we're living with the consequences and saying, yes, and all these bishops and priests have lost their faith. Well, if you give a little, if you nudge a little, if you compromise a little, it only has to be a little, and then you've lost a lot.
Well, I just don't agree, because I think that is what's the word? It's it's an anachronistic reading of the reality of it, because all these tensions didn't suddenly appear after Vatican II. All these tensions existed in the church long before Vatican II, and Vatican II was the chance to sort out some of these tensions, which the documents of the council did try and sort out, perhaps ambiguously. You could argue whatever you like from any of it. I mean, I don't think we can disagree with the principle of Dignitatis Humanae. They'd have a really difficult job doing so. But
Mark, can I ask you a question, a point of information? This is not an argument disguised as a question. It's a genuine question. To what extent is Vatican II predicated on the liberal world order? In other words, the Second Vatican Council was an attempt to adapt the church to what it thought was happening in the world order in the 20th century. But what we've discovered two things. One is that secularism is far more dangerous and insidious than I think people thought it was in the 1960s. But I mean, let's say, for example, Morello is right and we lose democracy to empire, whatever kind of empire, Islamic empire, Sharia law, Trumpian empire. Was Vatican II the attempt to accommodate the church to a liberal democracy that hasn't got much time left in it anyway?
I don't think it was an attempt to sort of compromise with it, but very much from the way that John the 23rd spoke about it as it opened. It was he saw it. So that you have to remember, the church was a massive edifice compared to what it was now. That people weren't really, the lay people weren't really involved in it at all, and that there were millions of priests and bishops and theologians, and it was a real sort of closed book, if you like loads of monks and nuns, and compared to the way it sort of is today. So I think that Vatican II was very much this. So they felt secure in this edifice, this ancient edifice, and the feeling was that in this new world of communication and globalism, if the church can only communicate that truth and beauty to everything else, to the rest of society, then of course they'll be convinced. So there's this extraordinary naivety, I think, about, if you read the opening speech, and that this was the idea. Let me
reformulate the question a bit, because thank you, that's a very good answer. But was the church's vision of what the new world, whatever we're going to call it, was going to be, was it mistaken? Because it looks to me as though the new world order, as they saw it emerging in 1960, may not last much beyond 2035 or 2040. In other words, it may only have been an 80-year period. So what the church, the project of Vatican II then becomes the church beginning to communicate and accommodate itself to a culture that only had lasted 80 years before it was replaced by something else. That's the question I'm asking.
So there certainly are elements of it, some documents that we don't even talk about anymore that were particularly of their time. Yeah, so that's definitely, any council takes place in its particular time in history. But let's look at the principles that everyone agrees on are at the centre of the Second Vatican Council, and that is a return to a Christocentric model and away from this idea of rote manualism. So there was some people would classify it as an ossified system of manualism, where if the answer to everything was in a book, and it was it's sort of a Thomist model. Now, I wouldn't necessarily throw that baby out with the bathwater, but you can see the way that they approached it was to change these things, to put back at the centre the scriptures. That was one of the main reasons that they tried to return to the fathers, and to put Christ at the centre of everything that the church was doing. So, but like we were saying earlier, it's, you can see that it's been, I don't know if this was part of this conversation or one we were having off camera, but when we were saying that you can see how Vatican II, the spirit of Vatican II, has hijacked the actual council, and the same way with that prayer of Pope Francis, that whether he wrote it or not, it sort of becomes the spirit of Pope Francis, doesn't it? Because it says all the things that people want it to say. And there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that a lot of the things that we're seeing now coming out of the Vatican, well, you can demonstrate it objectively, are, that they're saying, oh, this is Vatican II. There's nothing to do with Vatican II. I get that all the time. The Synod website or the Synod Twitter feed, they say something and they say, oh, this is Vatican II. Well, show me where that is Vatican II. No, it's not.
I can understand that what you're trying to do is defend Vatican II for what it really was and what it's been misunderstood to be. But the reason I picked up on some of the wording of Dignitatis Humanae is because the words "within due limits" in the context of Dignitatis Humanae refers to the idea that religious freedom, while a fundamental right, is not absolute and can be subject to reasonable limitations to safeguard public order and the common good. And that is what it states. And that, what I'm saying is, that is an abolition of Christ as king. And that is a recognition that although lots of it just takes a few little words, and those few little words say that religious freedom is a fundamental right, but not an absolute one. And it's subject to reasonable limits.
Okay, well, but you've got me at a disadvantage, Katherine, haven't you? Because there's you could pick out a sentence from any of the Vatican
I'm not saying this. I'm not saying this to say let's have a really long theological discussion about the merits or otherwise of the Vatican documents. Clearly, there's a lot of good in Vatican II. There's a lot misunderstood about Vatican II. But this was really in relation to a conversation that we've come to have today about Morello's article to do with democracy, which begs the question about what kind of society we should live in, what it means to say that Christ reigns as king, what role the church has to play, and whether the church, in making those little subtle changes in Vatican II, has caused this snowball that the abstract has resulted in the concrete, which we've seen during COVID, which you've just made you've just said this wouldn't have happened during the plague. The priests would have been out blessing, giving communion, whatever, administering the last rites, but it does happen now. So my point was, are we really saying that there's no correlation between some of the subtle changes in the church, as good as lots of it was, as necessary as lots of it was, that have led to this point where those abuses have happened? And why do the bishops not speak up? Well, the problem is those that do now could very well be told by the Pope or the church, well, you may be annoyed about this, but look, this is what it says in Dignitatis Humanae, you've got no leg to stand on, and that's a problem. And if that's a problem, we should be talking about that just as much as we talk about Pope Francis and all his subtle little changes in fiducia supplicans. Subtle little words here and there.
Not very subtle.
No, but I mean, it just takes a little bit, doesn't it? You know, we know Pope Francis is good at going in with all the, strong stuff and the stuff that people will like, and is consistent with the church going back over the centuries, but just a little change here or there, and suddenly it changes the whole thing. And this is why some of the traditional bishops have been, as Gavin always says, writing the dubia, questioning and saying, can you give us clarification? And no clarification comes. Should we not want clarification as much on documents that have brought us thus far as we do on the documents Francis is espousing today?
Yeah, but what are you saying then? That like the Declaration on Religious Freedom is wrong? All of it is wrong.
I'm not saying, I'm asking the question. I'm saying,
well,
do you think,
and that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
If you ask any of these liberal priests, I'll tell you one thing for absolute certain from experience, right? If you have a discussion with any of these priests who are pushing the spirit of Vatican II and say, okay, tell me what Lumen Gentium number 8 says, they haven't got a clue what it says because they've never read the documents. And this is half of the problem. Now, I'm not saying, like, you're right insofar as we need to continue to have a discussion and push the Overton window towards orthodoxy. But that doesn't mean that Dignitatis Humanae, for example, or Lumen Gentium, or any Gaudium et Spes are, a load of rubbish. They form part of church history. And my point really always is not to say, I live and die by Vatican II. No, I've gone through that critical process where I can remember reading Nostra Aetate for the first time and thinking, well, what on earth is this all about? How do you reconcile that? And I still would say the same thing. So I think there are problems there, and a lot of those ambiguities, we can talk about in Lumen Gentium, like we've talked about it before, that this language that the true church subsists in the Catholic Church, and there are a number of arguments that have been forwarded about what that actually means. But the spirit of Vatican II people took it to mean, oh, well, all of our separated brothers and sisters, all of our Protestant brothers and sisters are now welcome at our communion table, are now just as validly Christian as we are. But that's not what the Council Fathers meant at all. What they were saying was that insofar as anyone outside of the Catholic Church has elements that we see, of Christianity, of true Christianity, it gets those elements from the Catholic Church. And that the more people understand that that's where those elements come from, the more they're impelled towards unity, the more that they are drawn to the truth. And we see that time and time again with people moving towards the Catholic faith from more evangelical places.
Maybe not having had lunch, I'm not thinking clearly, but I'm just wondering if we're having three different conversations that aren't
probably
attached to each other.
Because
the conversation I was having, which has got nothing to do with what Mark was saying, and I can't make it have anything to do with what Mark was saying, but it did come out of what Katherine was saying, I think, if I'm right. The conversation I was having was following this paper on democracy that Sebastian's given us. What about if democracy just completely disappeared in the West and there is no democracy? We have, in fact, theocracies or empires. That makes Vatican II a bit redundant, because it seems to me that Vatican II is predicated on a liberal democratic world order. And so I was trying to say, what if that liberal democratic world only lasted 80 years? And then what we have after that is authoritarianism that Second Vatican Council doesn't speak to at all. So in a way, if you like, Trent and the First Vatican Council, they're universally true, irrespective of any political context. But it does seem to me, if I'm right, I don't know that I am, that the Second Vatican Council is dependent entirely upon a liberal democracy in order to because it's the gearing between the church and a liberal democracy. If the liberal democracy disappears, which Sebastian is preparing us for, then Vatican II doesn't count for very much, because it doesn't have a purchase. The gearbox is broken, so to speak. So that's why I think we're having three different conversations. I've got in my mind Sebastian's paper, and does Vatican II have any purchase in that? And then Katherine is relating it to Dignitatis Humanae, and Mark is saying, "Wait a minute, don't bash Vatican II. It's got something to say." And I think we're not, as far as I can see, we're not talking. We haven't joined our thoughts together.
I would say I'm more in line with how you've just expressed that there, and agree with what you've said. And I also want to point to, I believe, the invisible as well as the visible. So I think we're talking at a very horizontal level, and Mark's saying, but the document, are you saying that because the document says this, that priests are sitting in their parishes saying, oh, Lumen Gentium 8, or the document this? I'm saying on an invisible level, the very fact of its existence, the very fact that the church ever nudged or moved or compromised at all, whether anyone reads it or not, the very fact of doing it has implications that have snowballed to cause some of the crisis that we're in today. I think on a vertical level, and so I would say I'm more inclined to say the priests that you say they've got no supernatural faith. If they did, then they'd say, see the truth of the Second Vatican Council and wouldn't abuse it, and the spirit wouldn't take over them. And I'm saying, but the reason the spirit of Vatican II has been allowed to take hold is because certain modernist changes, as Gavin seems to be saying there, for understandable reasons, took place, that it changed something in the very people. Something invisible happened that cannot be quantified, that cannot be intelligible, but is nevertheless a problem.
Well, I think popular piety seldom follows the mainstream of theology. And I think that this is I'm trying to articulate the fact that it's a common problem to say that I've heard a lot to say, well, this is all down to this. And we like to do that as people. We like to say, oh, it's because of this. It's because of this event that happened. That's what made it all go the other way. And what I'm trying to say is, this is a trajectory that has been a movement within the church, and you can take it back to Trent. And you can take it back to Vatican I, because in Trent, what you saw was a reaction to the Reformation. And Trent is written very much in that language. And you can see a change in the way the church started to write documents, because it's an apologetic. It's trying to explain why it believes what it believes. And then you had the political pressures of Gallicanism that led up to Vatican I, and that's what gave us the proclamation on the supremacy of the Pope, of the papal authority. So there's always a social order and a political dimension to all of it. I have to say, I don't recognise the fact that Vatican II is totally geared up to a social, democratic, liberal society. I just don't. When I read the documents of Vatican II, I see a church trying to speak about the centrality of Christ to all people, and the importance of that in our lives.
So this is really interesting because I think so. That's why we think we're having three different conversations. Because I mean, it's only really occurred to me in the last 10 minutes that this is a new idea, and I'm trying to test it out. I obviously haven't explained it very well, but if we lose, it's entirely possible that we may lose democracy, and we've certainly lost liberalism. So if it were the case that in 10 years' time we only have authoritarian governments, so because, for example,
monarchies.
Well, yes,
we're not going to have monarchies, are we? Not King Charles.
But the principle stands at all monarchies.
Yes. So,
so
for example,
a caliphate.
What did Vatican II have anything? If you were an Orthodox Christian in the Soviet Union in 1970, was the mind of the church, as it's expressed in Vatican II, would it have had anything to say to you in your Sitzenleben there? And I think the answer is no, it wouldn't at all, because it was speaking to a secular liberal democracy. And I think what Sebastian is suggesting is, what if that disappears completely? What is the Catholic attitude to liberal democracy, given that it might completely disappear? And it just occurred to me that the whole Second Vatican Council was predicated on a liberal Whiggish notion of historical progress, as if what had happened in the 20th century was going to go on happening and developing, and the church needed to catch up and to kind of partner with liberal democracy in order that some kind of handshake could take place between the two. If it turned out, in fact, that the movement of liberal democracy only had another 60 years to go before it suddenly was completely eclipsed by authoritarianism, then I'm not sure that Mark's view that there's a trajectory going from the fathers right through the Middle Ages through to the Second Vatican Council holds, because the future suddenly takes a totally different turning. Now, I'm not saying that's the case. I'm just asking the question about whether or not our attempts to distinguish between Vatican II and the spirit of Vatican II might not be frustrated by the sudden loss of liberal democracy, in which case the Second Vatican Council becomes a bit redundant.
Yeah, I get that. I don't see that in it at all, Gavin, to be honest.
Oh, there we are. It was a question.
Yeah.
Right, that's fine. Moving on, Mrs. Chairman.
Just to finish, just a quick, really easy question for Mark, which I'm sure he'll answer in 5 seconds. Do you think that Pope Francis' teachings form part of church history, or they can be rubbish?
So okay. So I think you have to define what the magisterium is, and the magisterium, we have scripture, we have the magisterium, and everything has to align. Everything has to be the same as it was, because we're an apostolic faith, and so what matters is what the deposit of faith is. And we're constantly trying to, the whole idea of a development of doctrine is that we're trying to understand that deposit of faith more clearly. So it doesn't trouble me that we've got some wacky ideas, that Pope Francis has been pushing the envelope in one way or the other way, because I fear that the history of the church, the way that we look at things, is that we have to read it in line with the gospel. We have to read it in line with what's been taught consistently and always. And so I think you can see that basically what Pope Francis... So let's take, for example, his position on abortion, right? Where he has said some really good things about abortion. His rhetoric, if you looked at all of his quotes on abortion, you would say he's impeccable. In 200 years' time, if they went back through the documents, you could look at it and say, he says that having abortion's like hiring a hitman. And there are all these quotes you could say that would justify but we know, living in this time, that the problem is not so much the things that he said as the things that he's done. For example, praising Emma Bonino, the Italian Politico and abortion activist, going round her house and bringing her presents and saying she was one of the history's greats. And, promoting, was it a Flemish politician who was one of the biggest abortion advocates in history? And obviously you've got the whole smiling and shaking hands with Joe Biden. Yeah, he said Joe Biden's position on abortion was incoherent, but he still endorsed him. And that's led us to a position today where we got last week Mark Carney, who's the new president or prime minister, or I don't know which one, sorry, Canadians, of Canada, basically saying that he's pro-abortion and a faithful Catholic, which is an incoherent position, because if you're a faithful Catholic, supporting abortion incurs excommunication late sententia. So, it's an incoherent position for a Catholic to hold. But Pope Francis has brought us here because he has failed to speak clearly. His actions have not followed up on his words. And immediately that you start having that discussion about Mark Carney, someone will say, well, it was all right for Joe Biden. He was a faithful Catholic. And they'll bring you to that point. So you can see where there's a problem, like his teaching becomes problematic in that sense. And I think that if you look at the way the church will run in the future, that what will happen is, what's important is that we keep close to Christ, and that we keep trying to find ways to be more and more faithful to Christ and the message of the gospel that the apostles gave us. Not whatever pope we've got or any, like his job, and this is what I was always taught when I studied, is the Pope's job is to hold that deposit of faith until the parousia. Like, it's not to make up new stuff. He's allowed to explain the stuff that's already there, but he doesn't change it or bring up new stuff. And that's what Pope Francis has been trying to do from the beginning. Amoris Laetitia, Traditionis Custodes, overturning something that a still living Pope did. That's absolutely atrocious, just from a politeness, just from that perspective, let alone anything else. So I think there are lots of problematic things that Pope Francis has said and done. And I think the most likely thing that will happen is not that someone puts a big red marker for it, but that it just quietly slips off into history and no one really talks about it, unless some future Catholic unscripted trio do a series on the worst popes in history, in which case he'll be very close to the top end, I would imagine. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think it will do for now. We'll come back with a lot more, I'm sure, in the course of the next few years and discuss it, again, because I think it is something that we do seem to come back to, and that a lot of our viewers are interested in. And you use the phrase that Pope Francis did X, and that led to a position Y. And I think where I want to take you on is when I know that you can be a little critical of people who are going on and on about the Second Vatican Council, and in the sense of questioning it, challenging it, analysing it, pulling it apart, saying that it's invalid, and say, this is the hermeneutic of continuity, this is settled church teaching. And I guess I wanted to kind of to say, well, if the current papacy, if under Pope Francis you are doing all of that, you are writing blogs, you are questioning some of the documents that are coming out, you are challenging what Pope Francis says, you are picking up on McElroy and the problems he says, and this is your bread and butter. Isn't what those other people are doing the same thing, but just from a different point in history, 40 years before you, focusing on a different point, but you're still doing the same thing? And if the answer to them is just, let it go and focus on Christ, couldn't someone, the future trio of Catholic Unscripted, say, why didn't Mark Lambert, why did he bother writing all those blogs? Why didn't he just be quiet and focus on Christ?
Well, but I think there's a massive difference. And the massive difference is, if you read people like Ralph Martin, Dr. Ralph Martin, for example, these are people who have addressed the theological concerns with Vatican II, and they've understood it in an orthodox way, which is in continuity with the church. Now, and we've got a choice. We can do that. We can read it in continuity. That doesn't matter. That doesn't mean I'm not, Katherine. I think you've placed me as someone who is like, and all I'm trying to say, like, I am defending it, I suppose, in this conversation, but I feel like I've been put in that position where I am one of those people who questions it and who looks into the issues with it, and have written blogs and essays about the problems in Vatican II and how it's led to the problems that we've seen in the church today. But what I get upset with, I think, or animated about, is a position that says Vatican II is the cause of everything, because I think that is a new position that we've seen, and it's a position that's resulted from the bad 12-year papacy that we've just had. Before then, it wasn't so much of a problem. They were just like fringe people who used to say Vatican, like uber trads, and everyone else was sort of a bit more centre ground. Everyone else was like comfortable with the hermeneutic of continuity and away we go. But that was when we thought that the centre ground was solid. At least the Pope's got your back. And what we've learnt in the last 12 years is that the centre ground is not solid. And so people want to find a reason to, something to blame it on. And I think that it's far more nuanced and complex. Stephen Bullivant is brilliant on this. If you read Mass Exodus or his books on Vatican II, I think it's a really good perspective. And, I think it's an orthodox and faithful perspective that says this was going on throughout the world at the time. This sort of the socio-economic changes that were taking place went through everything and affected everything. So pointing at Vatican II and saying that's the reason, I think, is a mistake, because the reasons are myriad and still with us and will continue to be with us. And what are you going to do about it? Like, that's the thing. Taking a whole council and saying, oh, well, what are we going to do? Pretend it never happened? That doesn't make any, how do we move on from that position, with any sort of coherent ecclesiology at all? I don't think you can. So we have to find, in my understanding, a way of reconciling it. And the only way to reconcile it is in an orthodox way, so that it is inconsistent with, and if they said Dignitatis Humanae or Nostra Aetate particularly, like, all right, that was, this was wrong with it, and some future council did that, I'm happy with that. As long as we're moving closer to Jesus, that's really all, that I'm interested in doing.
Yeah, it's interesting though, just to finish, that it's you're identifying the fact that it's not only now under Pope Francis's papacy that we're having these questions about the Second Vatican Council, and one might ask or suggest that sometimes we look at Pope Francis' papacy and say, what's this about? We throw our hands up and say, we don't understand it. How have we gone to Pope Francis from Pope Benedict XVI? And look how unsettled we are. One response could be, well, because
it's Vatican II's fault.
Because it's getting us to look at, but by your very admission, it's only now that we're starting to unpick and look at this, and maybe that needs unpicking and looking at, and a return to tradition. And so that's what's happening under Pope Francis. The irony of ironies and the paradox that the Pope most keen to quash tradition with Traditionis Custodes and return and push for modernism and progressivism in the church is the one that's going to send people the other way. And why? Because that's what's needed.
Yeah, it's all in God's hands, isn't it? So that's what I think we have to trust, that Jesus is, the church is alive. It's not a dead, ossified organisation, and Christ is at the centre of it. And whatever's going on, we have to be aware of the fact that the Holy Spirit is working progressively in his church.
Yeah. Well, before we all become dead and ossified, we'd better break for lunch because I've kept you both long enough. But thank you very much. That ended up being longer and going in directions we hadn't planned for. But
can I put in a PS?
Please do.
Well, I'm aware that this might sound like I'm trying to have the last word. I don't intend it in that spirit. But what I'm going to be interested in is the application of Vatican II in Birmingham in 10 years' time. Because in 5 years' time, I think this city, which is an hour's traveling to the east, is going to become an independent Islamic Sharia-led republic. And in it, there will be some Catholic churches. And what will the relationship between the Catholic churches and the independent Sharia-led Islamic republic be? I don't think it'll be Vatican II that we look to try and understand that. And that was what the context that I'm trying to. It's in the establishment of an entirely different political context that I'm talking about, which I think Morello was trying to envisage. But one of the authoritarian new political contexts will be a Sharia republic in which Catholic churches find themselves. There'll be other authoritarian contexts. And again, so the question is, what purchase will the Second Vatican II have in those authoritarian contexts? So I think that's a very different question from the one that Mark set out to answer. So once again, I was not criticizing Mark. Mark was answering a different question, but I was trying to. That was my question.
And that's when maybe we'll have a discussion about Nostra Aetate, as Mark said. Right. Well, thank you for watching. Do please visit our website, catholicunscripted.com. And as we've said, please join our channel here. And if you do, you will get frequent member videos, commentary, readings, deep dives, and analysis. But for now, thank you for watching. I'm Katherine Bennett.
I'm Mark Lambert.
I'm the apocalyptically pessimistic Gavin Ashenden.
That's shifted.
Things are changing.